Now, Donald Trump's decision to hold back half of a $125 million aid instalment to the UN Relief Agency for the Palestinians has angered many in the Middle East and at the United Nations, with one former UN humanitarian chief claiming the move will have devastating consequences for vulnerable Palestinian refugees across the Middle East. So why has he done it? Well, at the beginning of the month, President Trump took to Twitter, for a change, to complain we pay the Palestinians hundreds of millions of dollars a year and get no appreciation or respect. Mr. Trump went on to say, with the Palestinians no longer willing to talk peace, why should we make any of these massive future payments to them? Speaking earlier this week, US State Department spokesman Heather Nauert called for more countries to give money to the UN Palestinian Relief Agency.
This is not aimed at punishing anyone. The United States government and the Trump administration believe that there should be more so-called burden sharing to go around. The United States has been in the past the largest single donor to UNRWA. We would like other countries, in fact, other countries that criticize the United States for what they believe to be our position vis-a-vis the Palestinians, other countries that have criticized us to step forward and actually help with UNRWA to do more.
Well, I'm joined by James Sorene, who is the chief executive of an Israel and Middle East think tank group called BICOM. James Sorene, it's not considered a punishment by the White House and Donald Trump, but what else can it be if they are restricting $65 million that would have gone to Palestinian relief?
Well, I think this week they were saying that they wanted to see reforms of the way UNRWA operates, and this is an issue that's been kicked around US politics for a very long time. The US is the largest donor to UNRWA. And UNRWA is a very puzzling organisation, which I think it's worth just reflecting on what exactly it does.
And it's the United Nations Relief and Works Agency for Palestinians.
For Palestinian refugees. So it's the only agency in the world that exists exclusively for one group of refugees, whereas the UNHCR deals with refugees all around the world, and they're potentially trying to resettle, rehabilitate, etc. refugees. The UNRWA, its prime sole purpose is actually to perpetuate a refugee problem. It's the only refugee organisation that allows you to inherit refugee status almost as a hereditary title.
Right. What do you say to that? Is that really what it's set up to do, to try and perpetuate a refugee problem in the sort of Palestinian territories?
No, I think that's to look at the symptom rather than the cause. I mean, it's absolutely true that it exists specifically for Palestinians and it has gone on for 70 years. That's not its fault as an agency. It's because the problem itself has not been addressed or dealt with for 70 years. And so those people are still refugees, whether they're in Gaza or Jordan or Lebanon. So the persistence of the problem is the issue rather than the persistence of this agency that hopes to alleviate it, doesn't hope to solve the Palestinian refugee issue, but at least deal with those people.
What impact will it have on services? I mean, $65 million is an awful lot of money, and it does seem, when you read the tweets from Donald Trump, that it's because he's not appreciated enough. Is that really a big enough justification to withholding this money?
Well, they've given $60 million, and they said that they will freeze the other 65 until they see changes. So it's either that Trump wants to punish the Palestinian Authority, or he wants to see reforms, or he wants to do kind of his America First bit and say, look, here is a question. Why should we be the biggest donors when a lot of very rich Middle East countries are giving very little, almost nothing? And secondly, there is the very real issue, which is you should be giving the money to those with the greatest need. So you were talking about Syrian refugees just earlier. We need to make sure, you know, British taxpayers' cash goes to those refugees. And there are very real questions about why, for instance, a Jordanian citizen who is the great-grandson of a Palestinian refugee who is a Jordanian citizen receiving Jordanian services, why should the British taxpayer be paying for their health and education? These are very real questions.
Well, let's talk about the money that Donald Trump has actually withheld. It is true, as James says, that they are the biggest donor to the Palestinians. In 2016, they gave more than double what the EU contributed. So why should the US carry most of that financial burden?
Well, no, I would have no problem with other people giving to this agency, including particularly the Gulf states who are very rich and others. But the United States is often the largest single donor to a whole range of UN bodies. And if you have an issue with that, then reform it and deal with those agencies. Do not make victims of the poorest people in this situation who actually have nothing to do with it. So if there's a lack of progress in the peace process, that's not the fault of a child who needs a school or a doctor in Gaza. And instead, you're making the suffering of those people much, much worse. And even if you don't, pardon pardon me, even if you don't have a moral problem with that, what I don't understand politically is obviously the risk is this will radicalise opinion in those refugee camps, the same places where both the first and second intifadas did emanate from. You are actually all but guaranteeing more hardship, more suffering, and therefore more radicalisation.
Do you accept that that might be the risk?
Well, those are very real issues, but I think at the same time, it's a very bloated organisation. It has more than 30,000 staff, it has more than $1 billion in its budget, and it doesn't just provide health and education. It does lots of things like support, microfinance, other bits of training, which there are very real issues. Why does it still do them? You need to put the money at those with greatest need. But I do recognise Jonathan, rightly raises those points.
Right. Do you agree that there will be Palestinians who will suffer as a result of this money being withheld?
Well, I think at the moment they've given the 60 million. There are other countries that potentially will step up to the plate. That's what the US wants to do. So I don't think it's the intention of the US to see suffering. And even the Israelis are also saying that they would be concerned if there was to be radicalisation and suffering.
Right.
And they're also wanting to hear.
This was not a move Israelis ever pushed for, I think, because they understood that you needed this agency actually from their self-interest, just as you need the Palestinian Authority to actually maintain life in those places.
Right. Although Benjamin Netanyahu has said it needs reform. What I don't understand is what sort of reforms are they talking about?
Well, you could make the kind of structural reforms. For example, I didn't know that figure of 30,000, and perhaps if there's overstaffing, but you don't deal with that by just choking off funding at a stroke. And it's so obviously in this case Donald Trump's kind of peak that he issued his Jerusalem directive, recognising Jerusalem as the capital of Israel, which had no previous US government in 70 years had done. And he's angry that the Palestinians are not playing ball, and so he's hurting them. And one of the things we know outside the Middle East is he uses foreign assistance, including UN assistance, as a political weapon, as if he is just increasing the pressure like he would have done in Manhattan negotiating real estate deals. He wants to squeeze his opponent, but real people suffer from that, and it's no way to conduct international policy.
And as a result of it, isn't it going to make it more difficult for the US to be any kind of independent arbitrator if there were peace talks to be revived?
Well, I mean, Trump has clearly made clear what his strategy is going to be. He's trying to rattle the cage, and he is trying to shake up these kind of decades-long firmaments in the Israeli-Palestinian conflict.
But what will it do to the peace process?
Shake them around. I mean, there isn't a peace process at the moment. The Palestinians are saying they're not talking to the US, but at the same time, from the US perspective, they've been kicking this can down the road for decades. UNRWA and the Palestine Refugees, Jerusalem, and for some of those people who are very pro-Israel and others just think, let's just face reality. It's part of this letting Trump be Trump and basically shake things up, which they believe actually, might force, for instance, the Palestinian Authority. There's a very big question here. The Americans have been pushing the Palestinian Authority to stop giving support to the terrorists in prisons and their families. $350 million the Palestinian Authority gives to them. Maybe he's trying to shake them up and say, look, show your priorities. If you're worried about kids and vaccinations in schools, redirect some of that money.
James Sorene, thank you for coming in.